My name is Alex and I am a cult survivor.
Hey Alex, I'm not here to convert you or change your mind. I'm actually here to validate what you said about Hebrew roots. It's really sad and unfortunate that people's self righteousness has led to total disasters in all the different congregations. People think they can abuse their power and do whatever they want, and it's not cool. I'm not here to change your mind about Hebrew roots. I'm not here to bring you back to faith in God. That's between the Creator and you. Now, what I will comment on is some of the doctrines you've been saying that they teach. Now, they teach the two house theory. And here's the thing, I don't have a problem with two house theology, right? The Bible is very clear. You have the house of Judah and you have the house of Ephraim, the northern house. I claim to be a part of the house of Ephraim as somebody who is grafted into the faith once delivered to all the saints. That's Jude verse 3. Now, there's this idea that Ephraim and Manasseh went to the United States and England, and therefore some people, as the people in your congregation, will argue that there are many people in the West with Israelite DNA. Now, I don't have an issue with this claim. What I have an issue with is when the focus becomes on the flesh. Because in Genesis 12:3, God is very, very clear with Abraham. He says, through you, all the nations will be blessed. And essentially what he's saying when you look at the original text in the Hebrew is God is saying, through you, all nations, they have a gate, they have a window, they have a path into covenant relationship with me, regardless of whether or not they have the DNA, the genetics, the blood. In fact, the people who were part of God's original group that he brought out of Egypt, not all of them survived. So, and many of them were actual Israelite DNA. So it's not the DNA that matters. What matters is the faithfulness. And you say that they point out that God's true people must follow Torah. And this is completely accurate. In John, we read Yeshua saying, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, his commandments are not abstract. He makes one of his commandments literally, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I came not to abolish, but to elevate them. So when he says that, it's very clear that people need to be keeping the front of the book, the Tanakh. But in your congregation, it's also very clear that people were using it as a mask to hide their disobedience. Now, you said they said a few things like no mixed fabrics are allowed, which is completely incorrect. The Torah does not say thou shalt not wear mixed fabrics. The Torah says you shall not mix wool with linen. And that's key, because the priests were allowed to mix wool with linen. And therefore, one of God's ways of setting the commoner apart from the priesthood and vice versa is by not allowing the commoner to wear wool and linen. Now, another thing that they mentioned was that there would be a second Exodus before the tribulation. The issue with that eschatological view is that yes, there is an ingathering, and yes, there is a second Exodus. However, according to the Bible, the second Exodus, so to speak, does not happen until the Messiah comes back in his full glory. Meaning, by the time the people are gathered in, the Mashiach will be here, the Messianic age will be here. And if these people are suggesting that the Great Tribulation, which is a 3.5-year event, is something that happens after the ingathering, they've got everything twisted all the other way around. Now, Yeshua makes a couple claims in the book of Matthew that can help aid us with this. Number one, he says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. Well, when he says that, there are people who object to this idea that there will be another temple in the Messianic age. And this is completely wrong because you don't even need the Old Testament to verify that. You just had Jesus say, this house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Well, in the first century, they had a sorek, that's like a wall, that they had around the inner court of the temple to keep the Gentiles out. So by that logic, since the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, if Yeshua said, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, and there was no intention ever to build the temple again in God's plan, then Yeshua would be a false prophet. But we know that he's not a false prophet. And the second thing is that he says that those who are faithful to him, they're going to come from the four corners and sit with the patriarchs. This is another part of the book of Matthew. Now, of course, when the people come to sit with the patriarchs, the Messiah is already going to be here, and he's already going to be reigning. And in another sense, too, there are going to be very many people reigning in his stead, because Daniel's very clear that the rod of iron that he has is going to be passed on to the saints. And the saints are going to rule and reign for him and with him. Now, you mentioned that there was child marriage going on in Melbourne, and this is just not God's will whatsoever. Where is this in the biblical narrative? You know, in the Talmud, you read about betrothal of younger babies, younger women in particular, at 3 years old. Not young women, children. I'm sorry, let me correct that. But what's crazy is there are people who will come at me, or you, and say, well, there are other parts of the Talmud that condemn marrying young women or children at that age. To which you've got to say, well, then what's the point of having this whole halakhic ruling? That makes no sense whatsoever. But the thing is, if we are to believe their tradition, it would suggest that Isaac and Rebekah had a 37-year age gap when they got married, which is not in the narrative of the Bible at all. In fact, Rebekah was doing adult women things by drawing out the water from the well. How does a 3-year-old do that? I'm sorry, I've never seen that before in my life, but correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe some of y'all have seen that. Now, you also said that women were told they needed to shut up and make babies. That's kind of crazy. I think that's kind of oppressive. Now, I do believe there's a patriarchal order and structure in Scripture. I think that's very clear. I'm not going to sit here and give you all the references. But what I will say is that if men were allowed to abuse their responsibilities as husbands and fathers and basically micromanage their wives and not do their part of the covenant contract, then that's a big problem. You also said that they said that autism comes from an evil spirit. Okay, well, I'm on the spectrum. So if autism comes from an evil spirit, then according to their theology, I have an evil spirit, which is absolutely crazy because the scriptures tells you what an indication is that you have an evil spirit. 1 John 4:1. Test all the spirits because not every spirit is of God. Well, that alludes directly back to Deuteronomy 13. I'm sending you a prophet who's going to cause you to stumble. He's going to perform signs and miracles, tell you to worship another god, but you're supposed to test this prophet to find out if they're a true or false prophet. And if they tell you to worship another god, you know they're a false prophet. So the Bible never says that because you're deficient in this way intellectually or because you might have autism or ADHD or some other condition, which in many cases, autism and ADHD are actually superpowers. But the Bible never says, hey, these equal something being of an evil spirit. An evil spirit would be like somebody teaching a totally false gospel. Then you would have to ask, okay, what kind of evil spirit is influencing their message? Now, you also said that people said if somebody was sick, that meant they sinned. Well, hold on. Have these people read the Brit Chadashah? Okay, it's like the Zohar. I pried open a prologue to the Zohar Pincus not that long ago, and it said if you're sick, that's because your soul isn't in the right place. Okay, this is a claim common in Judaism, it's a claim common in Christianity, but how about when Yeshua was asked who sinned, this man or his parents? Why does nobody reference that text? Because Yeshua gives a really clear answer, and he does make it clear that sometimes people get sick, and oftentimes many people get sick by natural circumstances. Okay, we live in a fallen world. People are going to get sick. People are going to need their bodies to heal. People are going to need to take time to recover. It's not an indication that somebody's in the wrong place with God. Now, they also have an anti-government lean. I think I need to talk about that more in the next part. But that's crazy because according to the scriptures, we're supposed to obey the governing authorities. We're supposed to not just obey the laws that God has for us, but the laws on the books, so long as they do not come into conflict with our faith. Like, for example, Daniel would have been obedient to the Babylonian decrees up until the point that the Babylonian decrees said, worship this other god, or don't pray to your God, that kind of a thing. Same with the three friends. So See you next time.